Well, let's dive into it. Christa, thanks for joining me today on the Minimalist Moms podcast.
Thank you for having me, Diane. This is awesome.
Yes, I can't wait to talk about the Enneagram. As I was just telling you, we did a podcast swap, and I was telling you on your show that I am fairly familiar with the Enneagram. I can give you a basic overview of probably each of the numbers, but I don't know how it always works, and I don't know how it works in relationships or really even the depths of who I am. So I'm excited to dive deeper into, specifically today, we're going to talk about marriage, conflict in marriage, but I'm so excited to dive into your podcast. You have a book on this topic, but quickly before we get into our topic, why don't you go ahead and just introduce yourself to the listeners?
Thank you so much, guys. I love your pod, and I am if you know Ennea speak, I'm a 7-wing 6 and a 749 tri-type. And on the Myers-Briggs ENFP. So I love helping people, understanding people. I've been working with couples for over 20 years. I love to integrate the best of marriage research with personality typing. So long before my Enneagram work, I used to be the assessment professional on my team of 20 therapists, but now I just love Enneagram and I do that. And in fact, since then, a decade ago, I moved to Florida, started my own practice. So I live with my husband, Wes, who's a type 1, wing 2, 136, and my kids who are all typed as well. Hannah's a 4, Jack is a 6, and Melody is a 9. And so we love to use this as a shorthand information way to communicate our needs and wants on a daily basis. Of course, if anyone here is like, wait, I don't know personality typing, you said a lot quickly, take a deep breath with us. We're going to get into it more today, right?
For me, the Enneagram has been a really helpful tool in my life, in my marriage, just knowing what my husband is, knowing what our tendencies are, and not necessarily staying stuck in the unhealthiness of some of our behaviors, but saying like, okay, maybe we have these tendencies, but it's okay to grow and it's okay to change. I'm not tied to this, but hey, it's good information to know.
Yes, that's so helpful. We get less rigid when we're aware of what we bring. And also, as you said, we don't have to deny every part of ourselves, even if we do learn, okay, I looked at 9 ways to nuance humans, these Enneagram numbers, and I found out I'm a 4 or a 6, whatever you discover. You can still allow yourself to celebrate the good of that too. And sometimes when we do personality systems, we can actually go so negative that we forget the good of our types. So I love for people to just use the system to engage with their gifts, to be a little bit more strong in what they do bring to their marriages and relationships and kids, as well as to say, like you said, okay, here's a possible shadow that we can watch out for in marriage or conflict.
All right. Well, if people don't know their types, they could either pause the episode or we can do a brief summary. I'll just have you, Christa, do a brief summary of each of the types so that people can get a better understanding of what we're going to be talking about for the rest of the episode.
Perfect, because then you can figure out your conflict style and notice when I'm going through them, all the conflict styles around your type 2. So if you're 2, listen for the 3 and the 1, or if you're a type 4, listen for the 3 and the 5, because you might veer a little bit to one of those for a wing. So if you're a type 1, let's go 1 through 9, you tend to be leaning towards wanting to improve others. And sometimes you feel like you're bad or wrong if you don't get to do that, or if somebody calls you out in a conflict. And so it's important that you notice, this is my tendency. I can be so logical, but that I miss my person. And then type 2, you're a helper and a giver. And so you might find yourself in such a fawning state during a conflict that you end up missing what you really needed to say about boundaries, etc. If you're a 3, you are so logical and goal-oriented and achieving based that you might miss the heart of your person and your marriage. If you're a 4, you are so in the depths and melancholy and also reactive in that way where you're so passionate that you might miss the opportunities for positivity and logic. If you're a 5, you might be so in your logical space of research and hacking out tools and tips and saving space and money and time that you miss opportunities for being generous, And that's a great virtue of yours when you can come into that and a bit more expansive with energy and positivity. If you're a 6, you are a troubleshooter and security oriented, and you want to be very loyal, but you can also be very reactive. And so you can miss opportunities to just have fun and be positive or very logical. And then if you're a 7, of course, like us, you can be so positive or passionate sometimes that you forget that logical space that we are actually naturally gifted at 7s as thinkers. If you're an 8, you can be so passionate and you're protecting and you're challenging that you can really stress others out sometimes by forgetting the positivity and the logic. And lastly, if you're a 9, you're so kind and caring that you want to be positive or just sort of disappear. And better yet is if you add in logic and staying power, as well as a bit of your own passion and direct confrontation. This pairing, all of us have a little bit of a tendency, as you can see here. We all have a gift, but we all have room for growth.
Okay, so let's get into the conflict piece. I'm curious to know, before we start, are there any types that avoid conflict?
Yes, we have types, all types in some way, but except type 8, who is the challenger. So we have 3 groups, and one of the groups is positive, and that's your 2s, 7s, and 9s. One of the groups is logical, that's your 1s, 3s, and 5s. And one of the groups is your reactive, and that's your 4s, 6s, and 8s. So we're going to go through all of those now. So 2, 7, and 9 really like to keep it light and positive. So that includes us here. And that includes anyone who's like a helper giver, or like us, joyful enthusiast, or these peacemakers out there who just want to preserve harmony. So our tendency in conflict tends to be, if we're thinking about survival mechanisms, sometimes we would fawn. We might come into fight later, but usually we would say, okay, if it's fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, I'll probably fawn and show a lot of love and care. And I probably have a lot of caring tendencies. This is not always true of every 2, 7, or 9. If you get more into the Enneagram, you learn about instincts and overlays and such, and cultural overlays. But generally speaking, if you meet a 2, 7, or 9, they're going to be pretty happy-go-lucky and also feel a little bit tentative and afraid to approach conflict. Now, interestingly, when we're trying to pair it with minimalism, it's actually harder to just be positive because stuff doesn't get resolved. And so our goal today is to help you to learn all 3 styles, and positivity is one of them, but you also need to learn from the other Enneagram types so that you can actually work through your issues versus just like happy, nothing bothers me, because we all know stuff is still brewing underneath if you're always in that place, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Why do you think that it's important to know one another's Enneagram number prior to conflict? Like, I guess for some people, I feel like if you are continuing to find yourselves in the same conflict, it's probably worthwhile to look up your number and see if it has, like, what could benefit you.
Yes, I do too. And I think it's a great system. It's sleek and elegant. Talk about minimalism. It's just 9 numbers. Whereas obviously I use Myers-Briggs and other systems, as I mentioned, but why I switched to more just Enneagram over those was because within the system, there was enough for me to even just learn on a very basic level, like we're learning today together. Like, okay, I found my type and I found the way I typically do conflict. And now I can learn from the other ways. And it's so much easier than just trying to take a map of, like, say, 50 different conflict patterns and styles we can use. Everyone has their own frame, but the truth is most of those are just generalist marriage manuals. And here we have a very nuanced way so that we're not just looking at you as you're an average human or an average female. We're like, oh no, some of us are peacemakers. Some of us are challengers. And it's good to know that before we have a conflict.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm thinking my sister, here, I'm going to call her out. My sister's a 9. She is a peacemaker. I'm curious to know what healthy conflict looks like for a 9, because if her goal is to keep the peace, I feel like, again, sorry to call her out, but I feel like she doesn't ever want to engage in the conflict because it's like, I just would rather be a peacemaker. So what is your encouragement there to a 9?
Yeah, and there's a lot of 9s out there, and that's a great thing. We love our peacemakers. We need our peacemakers. But like you said, when they're having conflict, their tendency is to, of course, go away, and they feel often like my job is to keep the harmony, but they forget their job is to make peace, not just keep peace. And that it's an important calling on their life to mediate, to have a diplomatic view, because they're very good at merging and knowing others' opinions. But if you really want to help a 9, understand compassionately that they honestly feel like if they say anything, you're probably going to go away from them. And so understand that you have to tell a 9, like, I'm not going anywhere and I love you. And I'm going to be actually closer to you from us doing just a few minutes of work. And you don't want to be overbearing with a 9. Lastly, for a 9, they are body types. They're very gut instinct oriented, in other words, and they really allow themselves to, it's just a natural part of them to get stubborn. So if you know you have a sister with this, you understand that they don't want to be judged. They already have an inner critic and they're like, oh, you're judging me now? You have no idea how much I'm storing. So they store a lot of potential energy and anger because they don't say anything. So it feels like a major injustice when somebody confronts them. So the better thing for 9 to do is get their daily body work in so that they can let out that steam on a regular basis and then take little doses at a time of conflict. It's better for their partner to say, hey, you, I've got you and I'm not going anywhere, but please do a little conflict resolution with me.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. Okay, I'm curious to know, I want to talk about why the Enneagram simplifies our relationships. So maybe we just start there. What is your advice on why knowing these numbers helps to simplify?
Okay. Well, I think that when we know our type, the first thing we really look at when we see the reading out of like, okay, this is what, whether Myers-Briggs, Enneagram, whatever, but here Enneagram, this temperament is gifted here. And like I said, I think that's awesome to know. And then also this type struggles here. So we use 9. You're great at peace. People feel so calm around you, but you also hide a lot of your anger and the feelings of injustice. And for you to find your voice and do your body work will help you to show up better and more beautiful and powerful in the world as you're meant to. So I think there's a destiny on each of our lives to have a specific gift. But when we don't look at our vices, then we miss out on really fulfilling that call in our lives. So I think it's a really important tool to help us to do that.
What is your opinion on the spouse diagnosing the other spouse as unhealthy to get perspective on maybe some of those behaviors? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it
Okay.
does. And our tendency as humans is the fundamental attribution error, which is to believe that we're a little bit healthier. And so it's very easy. It's the human tendency. It's not just positivity types. We all do it. And there's this sense of like, oh, I can't believe that they're this way. I knew it. They were unhealthy. So it's better than just giving them a mental health diagnosis, because you're allowing yourself to say, okay, maybe I've pathologized this and I can just say, no, it's just because they're Enneagram number. But when we start to put ourselves higher, that's the problem. And maybe you are healthier than your spouse. That's also possible, but it's also more helpful if you actually want to grow in your marriage. The better way to do it is to say to your partner, you know, I've been learning about my type and maybe some of the triggers you've talked about with me over the years. Wow, I see them now. They're sort of glaring at me. And in my book that I wrote it for not just regular everyday life. I wrote it for, here's the top healthy for partners and here's the worst for partners of each type, so that people could see in a marriage, this is what I look like when I'm unhealthy. And this is what I do to my partner. And I do that on my website as well. But I'm just letting you know that it's so helpful to see your own mirror before you point out your spouse.
Okay. So there are various groups. You said because there's 9 numbers, there's 3 in each group. You said 2, 7, and 9s are the avoidant, happier types. Is that how did you
Yeah,
do
we're
what
the positivity group.
positivity group? Can you tell me a little bit more about the other 2 groups and their conflict styles?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you are a 1, 3, or a 5 on the Enneagram, then you are a logical competency sort of person who enters into conflict that way. So you want to use the fallacies. You want to figure out who's thinking correctly. You want to use logic, and you're not necessarily positive. So it can come across as harsh or brash to a positivity type. And you're also not necessarily emotional. So that can be a trigger for the last group I'm going to talk about here. And then that last group are the 4s, 6s, and 8s. And they're great at showing emotion. They're the emotional reactivity group. And so everyone knows they're passionate. And so that's great. But of course, they need to also bring in positivity. And they also need to bring in logic, because we know when we're just passionate, we can miss that. When you can bring in positivity and logic and some healthy passion, you have a beautiful style for conflict reactivity, because you're going to get your resolutions and you're going to be breathing because you're positive. You're going to have some lightness, maybe a bit of laughter. You're going to show deep care, and you're going to logically be able to solve problems as well as take a break as needed. And so all of this is needed, but knowing which one you tend toward and which one your partner tends toward can help, because I'm a positivity type. I'm married to a logical type. And when I lean a bit more logically, it helps our conflict so fast. And then quite honestly, he leans into positivity as a reaction.
Okay. Yeah. You and I were talking about that a little bit about my marriage, because I'm a 7 with a 5. And that makes a lot of sense. Looking back to some of the conflicts, there is definitely just, he is always trying to logically make sense of some things that are just more emotional to me. And I just need to, to rationalize them before I can, I guess, work through them, if that makes sense. So you're speaking to me.
You have a 6 and an 8 on either side. So if we think of a spectrum or a circle with all the types around it, it's helpful because you are almost a 6 and an 8, and those are two reactivity types. So if positivity doesn't work, you're going to get reactive and he's going to shut right down. And so it's just good for you to know, like, I will try to be logical. I'll take my deep breaths. I'll try to not just be this positivity type who doesn't address it, but I'm going to try to share it as logically as possible. And meeting your spouse where they're at helps a lot.
Absolutely. So I'm curious to know, are there any specific combinations that tend to struggle more with conflict resolution in marriage?
Yes, 8 and 9, which is one of the most common actual just
Oh,
groupings, this pairing, 8 and 9. It's so common. There's a lot of 8s out there and there's a lot of 9s, and they tend to find each other and pair up beautifully. All of the 45 pairings can have a beautiful glow out there, just a light. But the 8 and 9 is this person who's a protector and a defender. And so, of course, a 9 who's a peacemaker is so attracted to that initially. Then later they can feel like, oh my gosh, you're encroaching in my territory. I don't have my comfort. I don't have my boundaries. And even though they appreciate the justice fighting the 8 does for them, sometimes that 8 challenger and protector is like, I want more of you. And where are you? You're off in your comforts. You're not showing up for me. You're not showing up directly in conflict. So can they work it out? Yes. But if they don't know their Enneagram types, it can become such a vicious cycle.
well, Christa, you've given us so much to think about. Again, I feel like the Enneagram is just, we could talk about it for hours, and I have before. But because we're just specifically talking about marriage and conflict, I'll direct people to your book because you wrote a book on this. But is there any other final word of encouragement you want to leave with listeners before we wrap up?
Yes, I think that when you're in your healthy relationship window of tolerance, you are so much better at solving conflicts. So just remember, even if you forget your type today, just remember that taking deep breaths during conflicts, remember that you bring gifts. And even if you make mistakes and you're owning that in your conflict, it's okay to acknowledge, I'm human, I make mistakes, I still have gifts. And then lastly, your relationship window of tolerance looks like you getting healthy rest and healthy food and healthy margin, so that you actually can have the conversations you need to have. And then that's where you come in. So thank you for all you do for this audience.
Well, Christa, where can listeners, like I said, I'm going to direct them to your book, but where else can they find you online?
I think my biggest space for teaching is the Enneagram and Marriage podcast. So you can find that on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen. And you can also visit me on Instagram at Enneagram and Marriage or at enneagramandmarriage.com.
Perfect. Well, as we wrap things up here, I'm going to ask you the 2 questions that I ask every guest. And the first one is, what's been a beneficial resource in your life? I'm not going to let you say the Enneagram.
I have loved learning John Gottman's marriage tools because he is very type 5-ish. I said something Enneagram based, but he's a very logical person who just lays it out straight on how to do relationships really well. So that's been a beautiful resource for me, my family, and all my couples.
Yeah, very straight to the point and honest. I appreciate his books as well, and he's starting to show up on my Instagram reels. So I appreciate just those little nuggets of truth in my day when I'm scrolling.
Yes, I love that.
Yeah, yeah. All right. Well, my last question for you, and I'll let you go, is what is something you can't stop talking about?
Oh my gosh, lately it's been Pure Barre. I used to be a major runner. I still like to jog, but I've come to learn in my 7 that I can't run all day. And so Pure Barre has been a way for me to strengthen. And it's something I do many times a week just to get back into not just my head, but my heart, my body. And it's been, even on the days I miss, I'm like, oh, I'm tired. Like I really enjoy having some strengthening training in my life. So I talk about it a lot.
I feel like we're very similar because I'm not a fast runner. I jog a little bit and I just started Pilates, which seems
Oh,
somewhat similar to bar, using your body weight to do various movements.
mhm.
And I'm finding it extremely relaxing. It's been one of the only workouts I've kept up with because I enjoy it so much.
Pilates is so good for us as sevens because you still get some movement, but
Yeah.
you also get the strengthening and anaerobic training. That's so cool.
Yeah, I'm really loving that too. So I'm glad that you're doing Pure Barre because I've heard that's a great workout as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank
Well,
you.
Christa, thank you so much for joining me today on the podcast. I've appreciated this fun conversation.
You too, Diane. Thanks for having me.